We continue to build on our program on vaccine and vaccine safety that we started last Monday. Last Monday, we discussed the notion of vaccine safety in general, drawing the analogies of safety culture in aviation industry and how a professional athlete trains. Today, we take a little time travel. We go back nearly 100 years in pre-antibiotic era to look back into the mind of a vaccine developer, that why was he putting in elements or metals like mercury and aluminum and even oils to his recipe. This is all important because every now and then these are subjects of intense debate and concerns and fears. We also look back at the evolution of vaccine vial to what it looks like today, the single-use sterile vial of today. I began by asking Dr. Nikolai Petrovsky of how different routes and different vaccine technologies compare to each other, if there is an advantage of one over the other. Take a listen. Is there a way to determine if one platform is superior over the other? And same with the route of a vaccination. Um, can one argue that one route is superior, or is it determined by some other conditions or the factor, or even your vaccination strategy?
So when we look at vaccines and break it down, as you say, into sort of broad platforms, we generally focus on what we call the antigen, which is the component in the vaccine that's recognized by the immune system. Traditionally, this was a killed virus or a killed bacterium. In some cases, it was a live virus or live bacterium that had been weakened. So if in effect it gave you a weak infection, but then that was enough to trigger the immune system to protect you against a more serious infection. So that's the antigen, what we call the antigen, the key component in a vaccine. And that was, as I say, traditionally delivered through an injection, into a muscle, usually in the arm or the buttock. From there, and that's like a 200-year-old, technology and approach that Pasteur was one of the people to really drive. More recently, the technology has been broadened. So now the antigen can be delivered using nucleic acid, so RNA or DNA encoding the protein antigen, so not the protein antigen itself. We have what we call polysaccharide or sugar-based vaccines that don't use a traditional protein antigen, but use a sugar-based antigen, and these sugars are on the surface of particularly bacteria. And so again, we're getting the immune system to recognize sugars rather than just proteins.
Right.
And then in recent years, there's also this idea of really designing what we call viral vectors, which are, and we saw that with the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine, where you take a known virus. In the case of that vaccine, it's a chimpanzee adenovirus that causes, coughs and colds in chimpanzees. And then you genetically modify that virus by putting in, say, the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, and then you infect humans with that sort of what we call a viral vector. So the fundamentals of what's in a vaccine haven't changed that much over hundreds of years, but how we do it is what has changed. The other thing that's changed is that, there's a lot more interest now in, can we avoid injecting a vaccine? Can we either give it orally, like a tablet, or can we give it as a spray into the nose, or can we give it through like a Band-Aid, a patch that's just put on top of the skin?
Right.
Although still to this day most vaccines are given through a needle and injection, There's an enormous amount of work going on to modify how they're given. So the mechanism of delivering the vaccine is probably what will change, I think, going forward in coming years. The other area in which I started my career was what's called an adjuvant, which is a turbocharger that you add to the antigen to make it much more effective. And traditionally, the adjuvant used in the majority of childhood vaccines is an aluminium salt. So either aluminium hydroxide or aluminium phosphate. Now, I say that because, of course, aluminium's been in vaccines been very big in the news lately in recent weeks.
Right.
Because of some media coming out of the United States. And we can go into that later, like the pros and cons, and why is aluminium in there, and is there any issue with using aluminium? But I guess my perspective, putting aside any questions about is aluminium safe or not safe, or what my research was directed at was, is there something better than aluminium? So not even questioning, let's assume aluminium's perfectly safe, but is it the perfect adjuvant? Like, is it the perfect turbocharger? And the answer even 30 years ago is everyone knew, no, it's not. It was developed 100 years ago just
That,
by
that,
randomly testing different compounds out of a kitchen. So,
right.
a scientist called Glennie just went to a kitchen and said, "Can I mix anything that I would use in my cooking with a vaccine and inject it into horses? And will any of these things in my kitchen make vaccines work better?" That's how he found aluminium salts. He
Incredible.
also found tapioca, that he could use the olive oil, and all of these things actually have adjuvant properties. And of course, we still use oil adjuvants particularly in animal vaccines to this day. Does that mean they're the best
No.
adjuvants? No, because again, they were discovered 100 years ago just through randomly testing. We now know what what are the signaling pathways in the body through which an adjuvant potentially could be working. We know the receptors called like toll-like receptors that activate immune cells. We can design compounds specifically to target those receptors. So the science has come like so
Bipartisan.
far. And so to suggest that aluminium found accidentally or serendipitously, 100 years ago is the best adjuvant, no, it's not. It is an adjuvant. It's been successful in a lot of vaccines, but it's not perfect. It has, in fact, it has a lot of weaknesses. That we don't have an HIV vaccine. Part of the reason for that potentially is because alum doesn't work very well as an adjuvant in an HIV vaccine. Same for tuberculosis vaccines, same for malaria vaccines. Do you know what I mean? So it doesn't mean that aluminium isn't useful for some vaccines. But there are a lot of vaccines where alum is actually the wrong choice. It doesn't deliver the type of immune stimulus that you need for that vaccine to work. Cancer vaccines, Alzheimer's, all of these vaccines don't work with alum. So my research wasn't so much looking at is alum toxic, or is there a safety issue with alum. It was, look, are there better adjuvants than alum? And what we were able to show, and 200 or more papers later, is that, for instance, we have a natural plant sugar called inulin, which delivers all the benefits of aluminium and far more, because it's successful in cancer vaccines, Alzheimer's vaccines, and a lot of infectious disease vaccines. But it's a plant sugar, so it's biodegradable. It's not a heavy metal, so you don't have to worry about, toxicity at all. We know you can give enormous amounts to people. In fact, it's used as a health food, inulin. So it's in a lot of yogurts and, probiotics. So clearly it's better, you know. But the most important thing is it actually delivers successful vaccines that alum can't. We tested alum in a cancer vaccine. It didn't work. We substituted it with the inulin adjuvant. It started working. So what we should really focus on, rather than worrying about so much about, these issues of aluminium, is let's just move forward and build new vaccines with better adjuvants. And, so we don't have to sort of focus so much on the past as looking forward to a better future. Do you know what I mean? If a technology is superseded, you don't spend all your time worrying about the technology that didn't work or wasn't as good. You just leave it behind. And to be honest, that's how I would see this whole discussion around alum. Look, let's move beyond it. Let's not have to worry about digging old data and, were there issues or not? The answer is it can be replaced with better things. Let's just get on, replace, and move forward.
Worried about the mercury contamination. I couldn't read much about it.
You shouldn't call it contamination. So mercury, or a form of mercury called thiomersol, which is a mercury salt, has been used in vaccines for over 100 years as a preservative, because right. It's mercury, traditionally was used as an antibacterial. And you'll remember in the 1920s and 30s, when there weren't antibiotics, they used to dress wounds with mercury.
Right.
Because it was such an effective way of killing bacteria and stopping wound infections. So mercury, and it also was used in dental fillings
all the time
as an amalgam. And part of the reason, I was talking to a dentist recently about this, and he said part of the reason is you don't, although we're working in a dirty mouth, if you put in a metal amalgam with mercury, they never get infected. And he said that's because the mercury itself is, although it's used to dissolve the metal and enable them to mould it into your tooth, the other massive advantage of using mercury in that system is that it killed all the bacteria that otherwise, whereas he said with modern fillings, if they're not careful, they can easily get infections under the filling, and then you have to have a root canal and all sorts of problems and get abscess. And that's much more common with modern fillings. But you never saw it with a mercury filling, even if it was done in India or, in just in someone's back room, not in a sterile surgery. The great thing was that it had a natural built-in preservative. So, again, the idea mercury is a contaminant is not true. It was being deliberately added. And it had a very clear purpose, right, which is that when you had vaccines in multi-dose vials, and so you were having to go back in to the vial multiple times to get those doses out, and you were introducing potentially bacteria and fungi each time you pierced the vial, you had to have a preservative in there. And mercury was actually one of the best preservatives. Like, it was one of the best antibacterials. So it was there, and it served a very important purpose that was necessary. Now, what then happened was the world moved to making vaccines in a much more sterile way, and in particular moved to what we call single-dose vials or single-dose syringes. So no longer did you actually have to have a preservative or an antibacterial, because each person was going to get their own individual sterile vial and or injection. And so we were able to take mercury out of those. So, but in the meantime, over 60, 80 years, of course, it was in all of the vaccines as a necessary ingredient. Now, is there evidence it was causing harm? Is there any evidence that having mercury in teeth fillings caused harm? The answer is, well, we don't really know. I mean, like
Right.
it's very difficult to say. Clearly, it wasn't killing people because I've got amalgam fillings still. I'm still here to tell the tale, as does everyone else. So if it was doing something negative, obviously it wasn't easily measurable. So it becomes now what we call a theoretical issue or a theoretical risk. Can I say my health wouldn't be better if I hadn't had mercury-based, dental fillings?
No,
There's no way to know.
but they've done wonders.
Clearly, they're safe because I'm here talking to you, as are billions of people who similarly have had mercury-based fillings. But in some people, might that cause a side effect, or or if they have other sources of mercury in their environment, will that tip them over? Look, quite possibly. You know what I mean? So, but then it's not a context of is the mercury in vaccine safe? Is if you exceed a particular level of mercury, including through your fillings, maybe at some point that becomes less safe. But that's a much more complex issue. So, but just in terms of the mercury in the vaccines themselves, and given the small number of doses people particularly were having back then, there, there weren't as many vaccines as today, and these were particularly, as I say, vaccines in multi-dose vials. Was the benefit of the mercury greater than the risk of getting septicemia and dying from an infection from a contaminated vial?
No.
I would say I would take the mercury preserved vial any day of the week. Having seen people die of sepsis,
Right.
And so everything's a risk benefit, and again, that's never discussed. So the reason doctors were happy to give mercury preservatives, one, there was no evidence that they were unsafe, other than we know too much mercury has issues, but
Of course.
in terms of the amount that was in the vaccines, it hadn't been shown to be unsafe, and they knew that not having a preservative in the vaccine was highly unsafe. That you would have people die from septicemia, from contaminations, and so it was a risk benefit. Clearly, the answer was there's more benefit than there is risk. When we had availability of single-dose vials, so septicemia is no longer an issue, we have sterile single-dose vials, suddenly you could say, no, any risk doesn't outweigh because there's no benefit anymore. So I won't accept even in a 1 in a million risk that, that mercury mightn't have some. So everything's relative, and as you said, everything's changing.
Everything's same.
But single-dose vaccines are much safer than multi-dose vaccines, and guess what? The Western world has moved 90% of its vaccines to single-dose. That cost a lot of money. It took more effort, but we've done it because clearly it's superior. It has better safety. We could get rid of the mercury without having to worry about is mercury safe or not. We could get rid of it. And so now people don't even have to debate the point, because there isn't mercury in 99% of vaccines. There is, occasionally there will be vaccines, particularly in the developing world, where maybe they still have to use a preservative. But they're very few. And as I say, over time, again, they're being phased out.
Dr. Petrosky, it's always been pleasure conversing with you, but the way you're approaching the topic today, like an extremely skilled surgeon who incises and takes away the skin connective tissue and reaches to the target, is just incredible. Really very educating, and I think that's a unbelievable discourse that I feel having today.
Well, again, it's just unfortunate that, particularly in these days of social media, that polarized points of view seem to be the ones that are heard. And no one wants to know what was the history behind the decisions. Like, what was the history behind, mercury being in vaccines? What's the history of aluminium being in vaccines? But also, how are we changing that history? Like, how are we moving forward? How are we progressing? No one wants to hear that. They either want to hear mercury's terrible and how it was a crime that was ever in there. Do you know what I mean? Or mercury is completely safe, and I drink 100 gallons of it just to prove to you how safe it is. Like, we have these extremists. But history isn't about extremism. It's about the truth of these decisions were all taken by very intelligent groups of people who were very knowledgeable, making very considered decisions. They weren't crazy. They weren't trying to hurt people. They were trying to preserve life as best they can, and if you look back at those decisions at the time they were made, in the context they were made, you wouldn't change them today. It's, but no one, as again, that doesn't make for good media to say that the people who made those decisions in those days were actually making good decisions. They were based on good science. But of course, like everything, the knowledge base we have today is 1,000 times the knowledge base of 20 years ago. So decisions 20 years ago, we might say, oh, but the science now says something slightly different. Well, you can't have the benefit of hindsight. You have to look at what information did they have back when they were making those decisions, and were those decisions appropriate for the conditions and the knowledge available at that time? And I would say absolutely. Like the history of vaccines is a history of a lot of work, a lot of soul searching. It's never been easy, and always the emphasis is on protecting human life. Like on ensuring that the benefits outweigh the risks.